on your butt?
No, it's the taser me, kill me!
This is what you do.
You got options. Whoa. Okay.
You're a legend, Chris.
Last week we get a letter saying, oh, you know, after all this fighting, we've suddenly decided that this stuff is unconstitutional. Well, duh. That's what I say. I don't know if that's a legal term, but duh. So we'll see if the Court of Appeal agrees on that account, and hopefully on account of the length of time that the Pavlovskis and Chris Scott were subjected to this unconstitutional order, we hope that there will be a reduction in other sanctions as consideration for a suspension of their civil liberties for a period of a month and a half.
Adam Sos here for Rebel News. You will very likely recall the extremely troubling sanctions levied by Justice Adam Germain against the Pavlovskis, Pastor Artur Pavlovsky and his brother David Pavlovsky, as well as Chris Scott, extending from contempt of court orders resulting from their alleged gatherings and breach of the original Rook Order, which sought to limit gatherings at the onset of COVID-19. Included in these extremely troubling sanctions, firstly, a travel ban, which would limit these individuals' constitutional rights to freely move about their country. But beyond that, there was actually, and this is the most concerning part, a compelled speech mandate, which stipulated that a long paragraph basically espousing the position of authorities in the government, custom crafted by Justice Adam Germain himself, be read by these individuals anytime they make any sort of public declaration on the matter. This was extremely troubling, to say the very least.
You want to make an example out of me, and they want to take the very thing that they are terrified the most, my voice. I will be preaching from prison, if needs be, every day. That's what you are. What are you doing to the clergymen in this country? Who are you aiding? Who are you aiding, man? You criminal!
Worse still is the fact that these troubling sanctions, these fundamental violations of their constitutional rights, they were actually subject to them for 44 days until, and in large part thanks to your donations at SaveArthur.com, an appeal on this ruling and on the sanctions particularly was successful, and this matter was escalated to the Court of Appeals. But like I mentioned, for those 44 days, they were deprived of their rights as Canadians simply for daring to speak out, protest, and allegedly host some gatherings. Extremely troubling indeed, as we mentioned before, but not all bad news, certainly. As we mentioned, that original appeals process was successful, and today we actually had an extensive session within court. I was there. I live tweeted all of that, so I encourage you to check out that coverage. The actual appeal hearing took place today. It took the majority of today to get through, and an interesting development, as we will come to see, is that AHS actually conceded, which had not been their position before, that they acknowledged that these sanctions were in fact a constitutionally violating sanction, and that Justice Germain had erred in his ruling. So they sought to effectively back away from all of that and simply uphold the sort of fines, community service, those other things that were already in place. So this was an absolutely massive victory. Now, this was not an official decision. The Court of Appeals can take days, or they can take up to, I think, 2 years is the maximum window they have to respond. Hopefully there will be a prompt response on this, but it's already a meaningful victory because we actually saw those serious violations of charter rights, AHS, Alberta Health Services lawyers, back away on that front entirely. We were in court today. Chris Scott was present, as well as Chad Williamson and Sarah Miller and some of the additional counsel. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association's lawyers were actually present, though they didn't make any arguments. They left their arguments simply in the submitted writing. So it was quite interesting to see several law firms advocating for freedom, with a couple of AHS lawyers on the other side, Alberta Health Services lawyers, trying to hold their ground, but clearly ceding more and more and more. So we are waiting for the ultimate ruling, but I think with the mood in court today, with AHS conceding so much, with the absolute victory on the front of constitutionally infringing sanctions being waived and backed off on. There is at the very least that good news, and hopefully more good news coming with the actual verdict itself. We're going to keep you posted on that front as well. But for now, we spoke to those people who were in court, some of the lawyers, as well as Chris Scott. Pastor Artur Pawlowski did sit this one out today, but once we have a verdict, we'll be sure to get to him right away and bring you an update. But for now, let's jump to some of these interviews we got at the courthouse with those involved.
I'm hopeful. I mean, it was nice to hear AHS concede that parts of our sentencing were charter violations. So it's always good when you hear even your adversaries kind of doing the right thing. The rest of it, I'm not even sure what to think. It was a long day. It was much longer than I had anticipated, and I know there was still a lot of there's still a lot of ideas that have been presented to the court by AHS that are very conflicting to what my intentions are and were. And one of those was that I don't have respect for the courts, and I'm encouraging people to not follow the court's direction. And I've always said quite plainly that if you're going to engage in any kind of civil disobedience, and you're going to stand in your principles, and you're going to refuse to obey government rules that violate your rights, you need to be prepared for the consequences. And I've always said you have to submit to the court. If the court, if you get arrested because you're participating in civil disobedience, you got to submit to that. And that's part of the whole process of engaging in that. So, to hear them say that I don't have respect for the courts and I encourage people to do that, that's not it at all. I encourage people to stand up for themselves, stand up for the rights and freedoms, and be willing to accept the consequences, because in the short term, you may have to deal with some tribulations. But that's just the way it goes when you stand up for what's right. Sometimes you have to endure a little bit, and then eventually the truth prevails. And I'm hoping that this appeal will give some remedy to those charter violations and get us one step closer to the truth, which is what's been done to us over the last 2.5 years is unconstitutional and needs a remedy.
I don't know if we're going to have victory or not. It's hard to read a panel. I was thrilled that they were very engaged, that they were asking what I considered to be the appropriate legal questions, and that they were considering the right legal principles. So it is certainly a step in the right direction. It was surprising and thrilling that Alberta Health Services acknowledged that the constitutional breaches had occurred with Justice Germain's order. There are still other charter issues at stake here regarding unreasonable and arbitrary detention that we pursue. Hopefully we'll get a decision on that, and the contempt and the sanction, and we'll have 3 wins from the Court of Appeal, but it's yet to be seen.
Some of the questions and the grilling by the appellate panel to AHS on the constitutional matters, especially, seeing as how their consent and their essential admission that the constitutional elements of the order are offside. They did this at the 11th hour. It's absolutely crazy. Last week we get a letter saying, after all this fighting, we've suddenly decided that this stuff is unconstitutional. Well, duh. That's what I say. I don't know if that's a legal term, but duh. So we'll see if the Court of Appeal agrees on that account, and hopefully on account of the length of time that the Pawlowskis and Chris Scott were subjected to this unconstitutional order, we hope that there will be a reduction in other sanctions as consideration for a suspension of their civil liberties for a period of a month and a half.
Well, certainly a sentiment of hope emerging from proceedings today. Ultimately, we won't know the outcome until we have this final verdict, but the sentiments discussed and the sort of backtracking from Alberta Health Services on some of the more concerning aspects of the Justice Germain ruling, certainly good news on all of those fronts. If you want to go back and remind yourself about some of the troubling details on the Justice Germain ruling, firethejudge.com is the domain to do that. And as always, I do want to remind you that these legal battles would not be possible without your support. Pastor Artur Pawlowski has said it himself. The court, the crown, can come down with a great deal of weight, and they have a lot of resources. One pastor alone simply cannot take them on, cannot stand up for his rights, cannot stand up for his freedom. But with all of your support and your donations, tax receipt eligible donations to the Democracy Fund from SaveArtur.com, this is all possible. As always, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Sos. Things are starting to look up. The tide certainly seems to be changing. We're seeing the travel bans lifted very soon here across Canada. But I want to remind you guys that the reason the tide is changing here is because people like Pastor Artur Pawlowski took a stand at the very beginning and they led the way. Don't allow them to suffer alone. Don't allow them to be overburdened by legal bills because they're the ones who have the courage to take a stand. You can stand with them by chipping in at SaveArtur.com. And I want to remind you, any donations you make there go to the Democracy Fund and they're tax receipt eligible. So again, chip in now at SaveArtur.com.